The parking lot of the Grandview Country Club shimmered under the afternoon sun as Marcus pulled his battered 1998 Honda Civic into an empty space near the entrance. The engine coughed twice before falling silent, a sound that drew immediate attention from the cluster of luxury vehicles surrounding it like predators circling prey. 3 men in tennis whites turned to stare, their expressions shifting from curiosity to contempt in seconds. Marcus sat with his hands on the wheel, watching through the windshield as one man approached and rapped sharply on his window. The manual crank protested as Marcus lowered it, the sound grating in the afternoon stillness. The man wore aviator sunglasses that reflected Marcus's tired face back at him, teeth unnaturally white against his tanned skin. "You lost, friend?" he asked, though his tone suggested they were anything but friends. Marcus shook his head slowly, maintaining eye contact through the mirrored lenses. "I'm here for the charity committee meeting," he replied calmly. The man's laugh was sharp and immediate, drawing 2 others to join him in a semicircle around the driver's side door. One leaned down to peer inside, scanning the cracked dashboard, faded seats, and coffee-stained floor mats with obvious disgust. If you love thrilling stories like this, subscribe to Hidden Billionaire Stories, like, share, and comment to never miss an episode. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus had been sitting in his small apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant in the less fashionable part of the city. The apartment was clean but sparse, furnished with items collected over years from secondhand sources. A desk dominated one corner, covered in papers and a laptop that had seen better days. This was where he spent most of his time, working on projects that would have surprised anyone who judged him by his surroundings. The invitation had arrived by traditional mail, an elegant cream envelope with his name written in calligraphy. Inside, Patricia Henderson had written a personal note explaining that she'd heard about his work with underprivileged youth and wanted him to join the charity committee's upcoming meeting. She'd been impressed by an article about his volunteer tutoring program, which had helped dozens of kids from his neighborhood get college scholarships. What Patricia didn't know was that Marcus's tutoring program was funded entirely from his own pocket, from returns on investments he'd made 15 years ago when he sold a piece of software to a tech giant for $47 million. Marcus had taken that money and disappeared from the tech world entirely. While his former colleagues bought Ferraris and beach houses, Marcus moved into a modest apartment and began investing with a strategy that seemed boring in its conservatism. Index funds, real estate investment trusts, municipal bonds. Nothing flashy, nothing that required attention or drew notice. He lived on a fraction of the returns and reinvested the rest, watching his wealth compound year after year while he wore the same rotating set of casual clothes and drove the same car he'd had since college. The Honda Civic had been new once, back when Marcus was a sophomore studying computer science. He'd bought it used from a graduate student moving overseas. It had served him faithfully through late-night coding sessions, job interviews, and finally that momentous meeting where he'd sold his software. He could have bought any car afterward, but the Honda still ran, still got him where he needed to go. Replacing it had simply never seemed necessary. He kept his lifestyle quiet, not out of shame, but preference. Wealth had never been the goal for Marcus. It had been a byproduct. What he wanted was freedom, freedom from corporate politics, from mandatory social performances, from the constant need to prove his worth to others. He volunteered because he wanted to, helped people because he could, and lived simply because it made him happy. When Patricia's invitation arrived, Marcus had hesitated. He knew what places like the Grandview Country Club were like, knew the kind of people who populated their committees and charity boards. But the cause was good, raising money for after-school programs in underserved communities. And Patricia had specifically mentioned wanting fresh perspectives from people who actually worked with the populations they'd be serving. So he'd said yes, confirmed his attendance, and driven his Honda Civic to face the exact scenario he'd been expecting. Now, standing in the parking lot with the man blocking his path, Marcus could see through the clubhouse windows to where other committee members were beginning to gather. Marcus reached for the door handle, but before he could open it fully, the man in aviators stepped closer, forcing Marcus to pause. "You do realize this is the Grandview Country Club, right?" the man said, drawing out each word. "Membership here starts at $50,000 a year. The charity committee raises money for actual causes, not for people who need charity themselves." Marcus remained still, his expression unchanged. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of tennis balls hitting rackets. A heavy-set man with a Rolex that caught the light joined them, leaning down to examine Marcus's car interior more closely. "Look," the heavy-set man said, his voice taking on false kindness that was somehow worse than outright hostility. "There's a community center about 3 miles down the road. They do good work there. Maybe you got the address confused?" Marcus opened the door slowly, forcing the men to step back. As he stood, they could see his clothes: khaki pants washed too many times, a polo shirt with a small stain near the hem, shoes clean but worn at the heels. The first man, who Marcus would later learn was named Bradley Cunningham, removed his sunglasses and hooked them into his shirt collar. "Okay, let me be direct, since you're not taking the hint. This is a members-only facility. The charity committee is composed of members and their invited guests. So unless you're here to deliver something, or you're somebody's driver, you need to leave." Marcus reached into his car and pulled out a folder, then locked the door with the key. The manual lock made a hollow clicking sound that seemed to amuse the gathered men. "I'm here because I was invited," he said quietly, holding up the folder. "By Patricia Henderson." The name hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia Henderson was the club president's wife, a woman whose social influence extended well beyond the manicured grounds of Grandview. Bradley's smirk faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Patricia Henderson invited you?" Bradley said flatly, his voice dripping with skepticism. "To our charity committee meeting?" Marcus nodded once. "That's right. And you drove here in that?" The heavy-set man gestured at the Civic with barely concealed disgust, his Rolex glinting as he moved. Marcus didn't respond. He simply started walking toward the clubhouse entrance, the folder tucked under his arm, his pace unhurried and deliberate. Bradley moved quickly to block his path, close enough that Marcus could smell his cologne, something expensive and overpowering that seemed to fill the space between them. "Hold on," Bradley said, his voice hardening. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but it's not going to work here. Patricia Henderson wouldn't invite someone like you to anything. You probably saw the meeting announcement somewhere and thought you'd crash it, maybe guilt some rich people into writing you a check." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Marcus could feel the other men watching, waiting to see how he'd respond. His face remained calm, almost serene, and it was this calmness that seemed to infuriate Bradley more than any protest would have. Marcus stood silently as Bradley pulled out his phone, his jaw set with determination. "You're not going anywhere until security checks you out," Bradley announced loudly, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "We've had problems with people trying to steal from the locker rooms, and I'm not about to let some con artist walk right in because he claims to have an invitation." The two other men exchanged glances, their certainty wavering slightly, but Bradley's confidence was absolute. A security guard arrived within minutes, a young man in his 20s, wearing a uniform slightly too large for his frame. He looked uncomfortable as Bradley explained the situation, gesturing dramatically at Marcus in his car. "He says Patricia Henderson invited him," Bradley finished, his tone making clear what he thought of that claim. "But look at him. Look at that car. Does he look like someone who belongs at a charity committee meeting with members who donate 6 figures annually?" The security guard turned to Marcus, his expression apologetic. "Sir, do you have identification in the invitation letter?" Marcus handed over both documents without a word, his movements calm and measured. The guard examined them carefully, then pulled out his radio. "I need to verify a guest for the charity committee meeting," he said into the device. "Name is Marcus Chen. Claims he was invited by Mrs. Henderson." The radio crackled with static. A woman's voice responded. "Please hold." They stood in the parking lot for 5 long minutes, the sun beating down relentlessly. Bradley had lowered his phone but kept it ready, as if he might need to call reinforcements. The other 2 men had drifted back slightly, their certainty continuing to waver with each passing moment. Finally, the radio crackled again. "Marcus Chen is on the guest list. He's cleared to enter." Bradley's face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then something harder and more defensive. "Guest list doesn't mean he's supposed to be at the charity committee meeting," Bradley said quickly to the guard. "It just means someone put his name down." "Patricia probably added him out of pity," Bradley continued, his voice rising slightly. "Thinking he'd be inspired or something. That doesn't mean he belongs in the actual meeting with people who contribute real money." The security guard looked uncertain, caught between explicit instructions and Bradley's obvious importance as a member. Marcus could see the young man's dilemma playing out across his face. "The meeting starts in 10 minutes, Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. "I'm going inside. If there's a problem, Mrs. Henderson can tell me herself." He walked past Bradley, past the security guard, past the 2 other men who had started this confrontation. Nobody stopped him. The automatic doors of the clubhouse whispered open, and Marcus stepped into the air-conditioned interior, leaving the heat and hostility behind. The clubhouse was exactly what he'd expected. Gleaming hardwood floors, artwork that probably cost more than most people's houses, furniture that looked uncomfortable but expensive. A hostess station stood near the entrance, staffed by a young woman in a crisp uniform. Marcus approached the hostess, who smiled professionally as he drew near. "I'm here for the charity committee meeting," he said simply. She checked her tablet, her fingers moving efficiently across the screen. "Name?" Her tone was polite, neutral, giving nothing away. "Marcus Chen." Her smile warmed slightly, becoming more genuine. "Yes, Mr. Chen. Mrs. Henderson mentioned you'd be joining us. The meeting is in the East View room just down that hallway and to your right. Can I get you anything? Water, coffee?" Marcus declined politely and started down the hallway. Behind him, he could hear footsteps. Bradley had followed him inside, along with the heavy-set man, their tennis shoes squeaking on the polished floor. "This is ridiculous," Bradley was saying, though he kept his voice low now that they were inside. "Patricia's too kind for her own good sometimes. She probably read some sob story about this guy and thought it would be inspiring to have him attend a meeting. Let him see how real philanthropy works. Marcus reached the door to the Eastview room and paused with his hand on the handle. Through the glass panel, he could see about a dozen people already seated around a large conference table. Patricia Henderson sat at the head, reviewing papers with a focused expression. "Look," Bradley said, coming up beside Marcus, his voice taking on that false reasonableness again. "I'm trying to help you here. You're going to go in there, and people are going to have questions, uncomfortable questions. Where do you work? What's your background? How much have you donated?" These people give serious money, and they expect everyone at the table to do the same. You're going to embarrass yourself and embarrass Patricia for being naive enough to invite you. Marcus turned to look at Bradley directly for the first time since entering the building. "Are you on the committee?" he asked, his tone genuinely curious. The question seemed to catch Bradley off guard. "What? No, I mean not officially. But my wife Karen is, and I'm here to support her." "Then you should probably go sit in the observation area," Marcus said evenly, nodding toward the chairs lined up against the wall behind the main conference table. "The meeting's about to start." He opened the door and walked in before Bradley could respond. Patricia Henderson looked up as Marcus entered, and her face broke into a genuine smile that transformed her features. "Marcus, I'm so glad you could make it." She stood and crossed the room to shake his hand, and the warmth of her greeting was impossible to miss. Several committee members looked up with curiosity, their conversations pausing mid-sentence. "Thank you for inviting me," Marcus said quietly. "Please sit here next to me," Patricia said, gesturing to an empty chair beside her own. "Everyone, this is Marcus Chen. As I mentioned in my email last week, Marcus runs an extraordinary tutoring program that's helped dozens of kids from underprivileged backgrounds earn college scholarships. I thought his perspective would be invaluable as we plan our new youth initiative." There were polite nods and smiles around the table. Marcus could see the same calculation in several faces that he'd seen in the parking lot. His clothes, his appearance, his obvious lack of membership in their social circle. All of it was being processed and judged in real time. Bradley had slipped into the room behind Marcus and taken a seat against the wall next to a well-dressed woman who must have been his wife, Karen. She glanced at him with a question in her eyes, and he leaned over to whisper something that made her expression harden as she looked at Marcus. The meeting began with routine business: approval of previous minutes, financial reports, updates on ongoing projects. Marcus listened carefully, taking occasional notes on a pad he'd brought in his folder. The committee was discussing a fundraising gala scheduled for the following month, debating details about the venue, entertainment, and ticket prices with the kind of attention to detail that suggested this was familiar territory. "I think we should set individual tickets at $1,500, a man said. The man who'd spoken was silver-haired and executive-looking, his name card reading Robert Merrill. "That's our usual price point, and it ensures we attract the right crowd." Patricia nodded thoughtfully. The right crowd meaning people who can afford to give more, which makes sense for a fundraiser. "Marcus, what do you think about the proposed youth initiative?" "We're planning to fund 3 new after-school centers in underserved areas." All eyes turned to Marcus. He could feel the weight of their skepticism, could practically hear them wondering what this person in his worn polo shirt could possibly contribute to their discussion. "The after-school centers are a good start," Marcus said carefully, choosing his words with precision. "But 3 centers isn't going to be enough to make a real impact. The need is much larger than that. A woman across the table, her name card read Linda Ashworth, smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. Of course the need is large, Mr. Chen. But we have to work within our budget. Want to see how the secret billionaire will turn the tables? Hit subscribe to Hidden Billionaire stories, like, share, and comment now. Linda Ashworth continued, her tone taking on a lecturing quality. We're projecting that the gala will raise about $400,000, and after expenses, that gives us roughly $300,000 to allocate. Each center costs about $100,000 to establish and fund for the first year. The math is quite simple. Marcus met her gaze calmly. What if you raised more money? He asked. Robert Merrill chuckled, the sound condescending in its casualness. We'd love to raise more money. That's always the goal, but we've been doing this for 15 years. And the gala consistently brings in between $350,000 and $450,000. That's just the reality of our donor base. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Maybe the donor base needs to expand. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Linda Ashworth's smile disappeared entirely. Karen, Bradley's wife, leaned forward in her seat at the table, her eyes narrowing as she focused on Marcus with sudden intensity. Mr. Chen, Karen said, her voice dripping with condescension that made the earlier hostility seem mild by comparison. Our donor base consists of the wealthiest and most generous families in this city. These are people who give substantial amounts to multiple causes every year. I'm not sure what you're suggesting, but if you're implying that we're not doing it enough, I'd ask you to consider that most of us in this room have personally donated tens of thousands of dollars to various charities. Marcus met her gaze without flinching. I'm not criticizing anyone's generosity, he said evenly. I'm suggesting that if the goal is to create meaningful change, 3 centers aren't enough. You'd need at least 10 to begin making a real difference in the communities you're trying to serve. Robert Merrill's expression hardened. 10 centers would cost $1 million, he said flatly, as if explaining basic arithmetic to a child. We don't have that kind of money. Marcus nodded slowly. Not yet, he agreed quietly. Bradley stood up from his observation chair, unable to contain himself any longer. His face was flushed, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. Okay, I've heard enough of this. Patricia, I'm sorry, but this is exactly what I was worried about. This man shows up in a car that probably isn't even street legal, wearing clothes from a thrift store, and now he's sitting here telling people who donate more in a year than he's probably earned in his lifetime that they need to raise more money. It's absurd. Patricia's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Bradley, you're out of line. Sit down immediately. But Bradley shook his head, his voice rising. No, I won't sit down. Someone needs to say what everyone's thinking. Who is this guy? What has he ever contributed to any charity? What gives him the right to sit at this table and criticize people who actually put their money where their mouth is? The room had gone completely silent. Marcus could feel everyone's eyes on him, waiting to see how he'd respond to the direct attack. He thought about his investment portfolio, about the accounts that held more money than everyone in this room combined would earn in their lifetimes. He thought about the tutoring program he'd funded, the scholarships he'd quietly paid for, the causes he'd supported through anonymous donations because he'd never wanted recognition. He could have ended this confrontation with a single sentence, could have revealed the truth, and watched their faces transform from contempt to shock to embarrassment. But something stopped him. Maybe principle, maybe curiosity about how far they take their assumptions. "You're right," Marcus said quietly, looking at Bradley with an expression of perfect calm. "I haven't donated to this particular charity, and my car is old. Those things are true." Bradley's face lit up with vindication, his posture straightening with triumph. "Finally, some honesty. So maybe you should listen more and talk less." Marcus turned back to Patricia, ignoring Bradley's continued presence. "If you're interested in expanding the program beyond 3 centers, I'd be happy to discuss some strategies for raising additional funds. But if the committee is satisfied with the current plan, I respect that decision." Patricia looked torn between defending her guest and maintaining peace with her fellow committee members. The meeting proceeded, but the atmosphere had changed fundamentally. Every comment Marcus made was met with barely concealed skepticism or outright dismissal. When he suggested partnering with local businesses for in-kind donations, Linda Ashworth explained as if to a child that they'd already explored that avenue. When he proposed a social media campaign to reach younger donors, Robert Merrill said they preferred to maintain the gala's exclusive atmosphere. By the time the meeting ended 90 minutes later, Marcus had been effectively frozen out of every discussion. Committee members began gathering their things and breaking into small clusters for side conversations, pointedly excluding Marcus from their circles. Patricia approached Marcus with an apologetic expression that conveyed genuine regret. "I'm so sorry about Bradley's outburst," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That was completely inappropriate and inexcusable." Marcus nodded, his expression neutral. "It's fine." He said what others were thinking. Patricia sighed heavily. "Some people in this club put too much emphasis on appearances. But your ideas were good, Marcus. I meant what I said about wanting fresh perspectives." A woman named Linda Ashworth had approached with another committee member. "Mrs. Henderson, could we speak with you for a moment?" "About the gala planning committee?" Patricia excused herself, leaving Marcus alone near the door. He could see Bradley holding court across the room, gesturing animatedly while several people listened. Karen was nodding along, occasionally glancing at Marcus with an expression of distaste. Marcus picked up his folder and headed for the exit. As he passed Bradley's group, he heard the tail end of a sentence. Probably thought he could network his way into some money. The hallway seemed longer on the way out. The polished floors reflecting the elegant lighting fixtures overhead. Marcus was nearly to the main entrance when he heard rapid footsteps behind him approaching quickly. "Mr. Chen, wait." It was the hostess from the front desk, slightly out of breath from hurrying. "Mrs. Henderson asked me to give you this." She handed him a sealed envelope, cream-colored and elegant like the original invitation. "She said to call her if you're interested." Marcus thanked her and walked out into the late afternoon heat. The parking lot had filled considerably during the meeting, luxury cars occupying nearly every available space. His Honda sat alone in its section, a rusted anomaly among the Mercedes and BMWs and Teslas that surrounded it like they were quarantining something contagious. He unlocked the door manually and slid into the driver's seat. The interior was stifling, the sun having baked it for the past 2 hours. He started the engine. It turned over on the first try, and he adjusted the vents to blast hot air. Before driving away, Marcus opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten note from Patricia and a business card with her personal contact information. "Marcus, I apologize again for this afternoon's hostility. I'm embarrassed by how some people behaved. If you're still interested in helping with the youth initiative, I'd like to meet separately to discuss your ideas without committee politics getting in the way. Please call me. Patricia. Marcus tucked the note back into the envelope and set it on the passenger seat beside his folder. As he backed out of the space, he noticed Bradley and Karen walking to their car. A black Range Rover with custom rims that gleamed in the sunlight. Bradley pointed at the Honda and said something that made Karen laugh, their faces animated with shared amusement at his expense. Marcus drove home through early evening traffic, his car making noises that probably did sound concerning to anyone who wasn't used to them. The engine ran rough at idle, the exhaust system had developed a persistent rattle, and the air conditioning never quite reached cold. Back in his apartment, Marcus made a simple dinner of pasta and vegetables, while reviewing investment statements on his laptop. His portfolio had gained another $200,000 that quarter, bringing his total net worth to just over $47 million. He'd been tracking his progress toward $50 million, the way some people tracked progress toward paying off a mortgage, though he had no particular plans for when he reached that milestone. It was simply a number, a measurement of financial decisions made over time. He thought about the committee meeting, about Bradley's accusations and the casual cruelty of people who equated wealth with worth. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered that attitude, and it wouldn't be the last. What bothered him wasn't the judgment itself, but the certainty with which it had been delivered. The absolute conviction that someone's car and clothes told you everything you needed to know about their value as a human being. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The number was unknown, but Marcus answered anyway. "Mr. Chen, this is Robert Merrill from the Charity Committee." The executive's voice was formal, careful, each word measured. I wanted to reach out regarding this afternoon's meeting." Marcus waited silently, offering nothing. "Patricia Henderson has taken a leave of absence from her position as committee chair, effective immediately. Personal reasons, you understand. I've assumed the role of interim chair, and I wanted to inform you that we've decided to keep the committee membership as it currently stands. We appreciate your interest, but we feel the current composition serves our needs adequately." Marcus absorbed this information without surprise. Patricia had been pushed out, and he was being dismissed, all because he'd suggested they aim higher than 3 after-school centers. "I understand," Marcus said simply. "I'm sure you do." Robert's voice took on a warmer tone, the sound of someone who thought they were being magnanimous in victory. "Look, Chen, let me give you some advice, one man to another. What you're doing with those kids in your neighborhood, the tutoring, the mentoring, that's admirable work." Robert continued, his tone becoming more patronizing with each word. "But when you're dealing with people at a certain level, appearance matters, perception matters. You walked into that meeting looking like you needed charity yourself, and then you started telling successful people how they should run their fundraising? You have to see how that comes across." Marcus's voice remained calm. "I do see." "Good, so my advice is to focus on what you're good at. Keep helping those kids. Let the people with resources handle the big picture stuff. Everyone has their role to play, right?" Marcus paused before responding. "Right?" he said finally. "Glad we understand each other. Best of luck to you, Chen." The line went dead. Marcus set his phone down and returned to his pasta, which had gone cold during the call. He ate it anyway, staring at his laptop screen without really seeing the numbers displayed there. The next morning, Marcus called Patricia Henderson's personal number from the card she'd left him. She answered on the third ring, her voice tired and defeated. "Marcus, thank you for calling," Patricia said, genuine warmth breaking through her exhaustion. "I heard you stepped down from the committee," Marcus replied. Patricia laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in its honesty. "Stepped down is generous. I was asked to resign after several members complained that I was bringing in inappropriate guests and wasting everyone's time. Bradley Cunningham was particularly vocal, apparently. He told Robert that I was losing perspective, that I'd been taken in by a charity case who was trying to scam the committee." They talked for several minutes, and Patricia reiterated her interest in supporting the youth initiative independently of the club committee. Marcus promised to send her information about his tutoring program and his ideas for expansion. "One more thing," Patricia said before they hung up, her voice taking on a firmer quality. "I want you to know that not everyone at that meeting felt the way Bradley and his friends did. Several people called me afterward to apologize for the hostile atmosphere. Good people get drowned out by loud ones sometimes." Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus continued his normal routine, working with his tutoring students, managing his investments, living his quiet life in the apartment above the Vietnamese restaurant. He didn't hear anything from Patricia or anyone else connected to the Grandview Country Club, and he didn't expect to. The incident had been an interesting disruption to his usual patterns, but it changed nothing fundamental about his life or his choices. Then, on a Tuesday morning, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, but decided to answer. "Is this Marcus Chen?" The voice was male, professional, unfamiliar, with an edge that suggested legal training. "Yes." "Mr. Chen, my name is David Morrison. I'm an attorney representing the Grandview Country Club. I'm calling regarding a legal matter that's come to our attention." Marcus sat up straighter in his chair, suddenly alert. "What kind of legal matter?" Morrison's voice remained professionally neutral. "The club has filed a report with local authorities regarding potential fraud that occurred at a charity committee meeting 3 weeks ago." Marcus felt a strange calm settling over him as Morrison continued. "Specifically, allegations that you misrepresented yourself as a donor or potential donor in order to gain access to the meeting under false pretenses. The club takes these matters very seriously. We're giving you the opportunity to respond formally before this proceeds further. I'd strongly recommend you retain legal counsel." Marcus's voice remained steady. "I didn't misrepresent anything. I was invited by Patricia Henderson. I attended the meeting she invited me to, that's all." Morrison's tone sharpened slightly. "And hurt you?" "Nevertheless, the club has significant legal resources and a strong interest in protecting its reputation and members from fraudulent activity. If this goes forward, there will be an investigation into your finances, your background, your activities. Everything will be examined. Given your apparent financial situation, I imagine that could be quite difficult for you." The threat was barely veiled, designed to intimidate. Marcus could picture Morrison sitting in some expensive office, confident he was dealing with someone who would be scared into silence by the mere mention of an investigation. "Send me whatever documentation you need me to review," Marcus said calmly, his voice betraying no emotion. "I'll respond appropriately." He hung up and sat in the quiet apartment, listening to the sounds of the city outside his window. The cascade of events had led to this moment. He had driven to a charity meeting in an old car, been judged for his appearance, suggested they aim higher with their fundraising, and now faced legal threats for fraud. He thought about revealing everything, about showing them exactly who they'd been threatening. But instead he picked up his phone and called his attorney, a man named James Whitmore, who had handled his software sale 15 years ago. "James, I need your help with something," Marcus said when Whitmore answered. He explained the situation concisely. After a long pause, Whitmore laughed. "Oh, Marcus, this is going to be educational for them. Send me everything. Let's show these people exactly who they've been mocking." Marcus smiled slightly, looking out his window at the city he owned more of than they could imagine. Sometimes the quiet ones held all the power. Sometimes the lesson came when they least expected it. Shocked by this billionaire's rise? Subscribe to Hidden Billionaire Stories, like, share, and comment for more unbelievable stories.